Today on the Bridgehead, we're going to be looking at a Vancouver Parks Board councilman breaking down in tears over a Harry Potter event in Stanley Park. Then we're going to be looking at a far more sinister story. An artificial intelligence platform called the Platform of Respect has been designed and developed to identify and prosecute critics of LGBT ideology. And finally, we're going to look at the fight against euthanasia in Canada. There's some really good news and there's some bad news. You need to hear both. That's all coming up. So it seems like Harry Potter is getting deported from Canada. Barely a week goes by now without the world being reminded that Canada has become a woke laughingstock. And when I say laughingstock, I'm serious. Some stories, as ridiculous as they are, and despite how apparent of a symptom they are of how thoroughly the woke rot has kind of permeated through Canada's institutions until we're basically termites holding hands, they are still really funny as well. So this one happened earlier this month. On October 7, the Vancouver Park Board unanimously passed a motion to apologize for all the pain and all the suffering that they had caused to Vancouver's LGBT community, as well as Canada's LGBT community. Now, you might wonder what happened, right? Maybe a hate crime, something serious for sure, because there was counselors breaking down in tears at this Vancouver Park Board meeting. And when I mean counselors, I mean like these are adult people who have presumably gone all the way through puberty, experienced things in their life, encountered grief and things like that. But this was something else, because as it turns out, Stanley Park was hosting a Harry Potter themed attraction. And it was called Harry Potter, A Forbidden Forest Experience. The title ended up being far more on the nose than the people planning the attraction actually counted on. And because author JK Rowling is opposed to gender ideology, a media-driven campaign launched by LGBT activists kind of forced the Vancouver Park Board to hold a sniveling display of regret while they apologized for permitting this to happen. Now, the funny thing about this kind of stuff is the extent to which Canada's national conversation is totally dominated by a handful of people. So you have a couple of LGBT activists and LGBT NGOs, most of which are funded by the government to begin with, who announce that something is an issue. This gets reported to the taxpayer-funded press. The press then covers the issue as if it's an issue that normal people care about. And then that forces the politicians who are also funding these organizations to respond, and then you get the kind of scene that unfolded earlier this month. So the Canadian press reported on this with the utmost solemnity. CTV News wrote the following. This is great. I can't believe people get paid for this stuff. Members of the city's transgender, gender diverse, and two-spirit communities had expressed concerns about the decision to partner with this event this holiday season due to its association with JK Rowling, author of the 7 Harry Potter novels. Those are, as you might know, children's novels that were made into children's movies. But she's also a best-selling author of a whole string of books. Her most recent book that came out earlier this fall went straight to the top of the Times bestseller list. She turns out to be doing just fine. And so the international press was actually struggling to conceal its contempt for this whole thing. The Daily Mail's report, the Daily Mail is a UK newspaper, was titled, "Woke Lawmaker Sobs and Apologizes for City Hosting Transphobic Harry Potter Event After Enraged JK Rowling Critics Demanded its cancellation." We're a fundamentally unserious country, and anybody who doesn't live here can see it. Because this is the sort of thing that if you were bawling about this as a kid, your dad would just tell you to grow up, and he should. And so here's a quote from the Daily Mail, which is just it's a great paragraph, because the guy covering this for the international press cannot even conceal his overt contempt for the Commonwealth partner that he is commenting on. A Liberal Vancouver lawmaker choked back tears as he apologized for the city's decision to host a Harry Potter event after it was branded transphobic. Scott Jensen agreed with the members of the LGBTQ+ community who claimed it was offensive to host the magical-themed forest walk in light of Rowling's attitude towards trans people. He became emotional as he addressed those who voiced their concerns at a park board meeting, telling them, "I've been really moved by your words, the lived experiences, the hurt. And so on behalf of myself, I do apologize." There is almost nothing more nauseating than adult men sobbing their apologies to gender-confused men, identifying as women, and promising the LGBT community that they will never again submit them to the trauma of having a children's theme park featuring one of the most popular children's franchises of the last century because the author of the books just doesn't think that men can become women. It is truly embarrassing, and you do kind of wonder if some of the people that are sobbing are taking some estrogen themselves. Now, the city of Vancouver has been fixated on these LGBT policies for years, so that in 2016, they unveiled their transgender, gender diverse, and two-spirit action plan, and the LGBT group community sniveled that it is in part because of that trust that has been cultivated over these years. The news of this event was met with such intense shock and disappointment. You have to be heartless not to laugh at this stuff. To be clear, again, the intense shock and disappointment was because of a Harry Potter children's adventure being held in Stanley Park, a children's theme park. It is difficult to come up with a scenario more pathetic than this. And then, of course, they also brought up Trump's policies because why not? The current prime minister literally is prime minister because he ran against Trump. But somehow everything that happens in Canada, whenever somebody with basic common sense stands up and is like, hey, maybe that's too far. Maybe adult men shouldn't be crying at Vancouver Park Board meetings over a children's themed show. And yet Trump is somehow responsible for all of this. Commissioner Tom Digby went so far as to ask the board to reaffirm its support for inclusionary policies and to ensure the 2S LGBTQ plus advisory committee is consulted on any future events with equity or human rights implications, which is apparently what we're facing with the Fantasy Forest Harry Potter event in Stanley Park. The Harry Potter thing is apparently one of those events, and on October 8, Digby posted on X last night, the park board did the right thing, apologized to the TG2S community after an emotional discussion, shared some tears, disavowed JKR, will undertake concrete actions to rebuild trust. This is, it must be emphasized, it cannot be emphasized too much, an adult male referring to a children's Harry Potter event who shared some tears and then disavowed JK Rowling. And then each commissioner at the Vancouver Board Park meeting individually apologized to the trans community and promised that this would never happen again. This being the enchanted forest, forbidden forest, very forbidden forest, apparently. Rowling, however, apparently, so I don't know why trans activists think it's a good idea to go after JK Rowling. She is one of the best-selling writers alive, and yet they consistently think it's a good idea to go after somebody who makes crafting language her business. And so she just thoroughly enjoys all of this. And so she reposted Tom Digby's sanctimonious post with the caption, "To be honest, I didn't even know Vancouver Parks and Recreation had avowed me, so the disavowal hasn't been much of a blow. Next time, send me a certificate of avowal, wait until I've proudly framed it, hung over my PC, taken a selfie with it, and then revoke it." When someone jokingly commented that she might never recover from this, Rowling responded, "I wouldn't say never, but with time, therapy, and the support of my family, I anticipate that I'll be able to hear the words Vancouver Parks and Recreations without suffering a serious breakdown within 2 to 3 years." No. Or as another commentator noted, a safe space is now somewhere a man can expose himself in front of women, but nobody can talk about Harry Potter, which is a bit on the nose. Now, I know this is a small story, but you cannot help but read this and think almost 2,000 years of Western civilization. And this is where leadership has devolved to, right? 2,000 years of blood, sweat, and tears of constructing great cathedrals and perfecting democracy and writing great works of literature. And where does it end? With Tom Digby sniveling in front of a bunch of trans activists, disavowing a children's author, and promising that this is never going to happen again. This children's theme park right next to the Vancouver Aquarium. Sharing tears and disavowing a female author because she doesn't think men in dresses are women. Now, the ancestors that Digby no doubt despises as transphobes are lucky not to be around to see him. Imagine what his forebears would think of that display. But at least all of this triggered the response to from JK Rowling, that we all got to enjoy together. One of the reasons that childish LGBT activists running your society is so dangerous was really highlighted by a story out of Brazil that almost nobody in the international press has covered yet. In fact, I had the story originally sent to me by Isabella Sipa, who is a refugee in Europe because she was facing up to 25 years in prison for misgendering a trans-identifying male politician. And this is honestly one of the most horrifying and sinister stories I have covered in years. So think about the people I was talking about in the previous story. Now imagine what happens when they basically have all of the power to impose their will on an entire society. That's what we see happening in Brazil right now. So President Lula da Silva has basically taken another giant step towards totalitarianism with a launch of a massive platform that is designed to streamline the prosecution of those who criticize LGBT ideology. So basically those like JK Rowling who misgenders people on social media basically every day now. With Orwellian irony, and you couldn't make this up, this new artificial intelligence platform is referred to as the platform of respect. The platform of respect. Now, GP1, which is a major Brazilian news outlet, first broke the news, and I got a translation of it. Here is how they announced the story. The Ministry of Human Rights, again, sounds like something straight out of Orwell, in partnership with LGBT NGOs, launched a platform aimed at holding legally accountable authors of publications considered to be disinformation or hate speech against LGBTI plus people and other gender identities. So this platform of respect was funded by a pretty massive donation from a parliamentary amendment that was sponsored by Erica Hilton. Now, Erica Hilton is the trans activist who launched charges against Isabella Sipa and others for referring to him as a male. He is a trans-identifying male politician who was identified in Sao Paulo, and anybody who's correctly referring to him as a male is being investigated by police, and some people have been charged. And so he managed to get about 50,000 euros designated towards this massive platform. And according to GP1, and this is really sinister stuff, the system uses an artificial intelligence tool called Alethea, which according to its official website seeks to track the origin of disinformation, report its impact, and enable accountability for authors and disseminators. Enable accountability for authors and disseminators. And so the disinformation this AI platform will be tracking includes misgendering politicians. Again, another incredibly Orwellian term, because what they mean is that if you correctly refer to a trans-identifying politician by their actual biological sex, that will be classified as misgendering, and it's a prosecutable offense in Brazil. So again, as I mentioned, Sipa is just one example. She was facing up to 25 years, is now residing in an unnamed European country where she was formally granted asylum status. And this is because in 2019, Brazil's Supreme Federal Court ruled that discrimination against the LGBTQ community is a form of racism under the country's anti-racial discrimination laws, and that transphobia is now an offense under Brazil's penal code. And so there's been a number of high-profile investigations and prosecutions of Brazilian citizens for transphobia, with some facing hefty prison sentences as a result. So here's another description from GP1. Initially, the project presents itself as a hybrid fact-checking agency, bringing together legal and communications professionals to work over 18 months to combat fake news on social media. During the launch, held on September 16, Jean Muxon, the platform's coordinator, explained that the main objective is to, get this, continuously monitor profiles and media accounts, identifying problematic content, and then eventually filing criminal complaints. So people post things online, like Isabella Sipa posted things on Instagram. This AI is meant to be constantly scanning what people post, identifying potential hate crimes. It stores this information on a server and then forwards it directly to prosecutors to streamline the prosecution of those who disagree with LGBT ideology. Again, people like JK Rowling. Muxon said, "We created a platform with several artificial intelligence tools that continuously monitor pages, profiles, websites, and blogs. The technology analyzes discourse, intentions, and the nuances of the Portuguese language," that's Brazil's national language, "including irony and sarcasm, which traditional methods don't automatically detect. And when it identifies alleged fake news or a post containing hate speech, the system stores the content in a repository, which can be forwarded to the courts after evaluation by a lawyer hired by the NGO." That is the LGBT NGO. This is incredibly sinister stuff. It's taking all those individual cases of people being prosecuted for so-called transphobia, and it's ramping it all the way up. It basically means that all online speech, that's at least their goal, will be constantly scanned by government-funded AI, the platform of respect. The money for this was essentially garnered, by the way, by Erica Hilton, a trans activist who has already gotten people arrested and charged, and the intention is to basically eliminate anybody's ability to criticize LGBT ideology or LGBT activists. So hate speech, it's basically defined by the state. Now it includes affirming the sex binary, rejecting the idea that men can become women, and all evidence, again, is reviewed for potential criminal prosecution. This is the fusion of totalitarian LGBT ideology and AI technology. This is basically what China's social credit system looks like if China's whole social credit system was just oriented towards prosecuting those who do not accept the premises of LGBT ideology. Now, in case you thought it couldn't get more sinister, the platform of respect will also monitor the profiles of members of Congress and state assemblies, as well as influencers, blogs, and news sites. And it was developed by a startup, while the LGBTI Plus Alliance's permanent team consists of 4 professionals, a coordinator, a lawyer, a journalist, and a designer with an annual budget that is accorded to them for this purpose. So the persecution of ordinary citizens on behalf of the LGBT movement will be funded by the state. That is, by the taxpayers being targeted. And so I reached out to Isabella Sipa to ask her what she thought of this story. And she basically said to me, Brazil is cosplaying 1984 on steroids. And she noted that the platform of respect will likely create a flood of similar prosecutions. Using artificial intelligence to hunt political dissidents is something we once thought belonged far from Brazil's reality. But today, Brazilian society must fear being caught by the state committing the terrible crime of saying 2 + 2 = 4. Now, I want to emphasize again that the platform is being funded by public funds that was brought about by a politician who was known for suing anybody who dares to point out that he's a man and for threatening any woman who calls him a man with imprisonment. And this was created in partnership with the Ministry of Human Rights. So another activist recently from Brazil was charged in February by the Federal Public Prosecutor's Office. So this gives you an idea of the kinds of prosecutions that will be brought about by this platform of respect, merely for posting a video about the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir and stating in a separate post that trans women aren't women. Erica Hilton is listed as a victim in this lawsuit, despite the fact that Hilton is not mentioned in either of the posts put out by this woman. Hilton also happens to serve as prosecutor's assistant in that case. Now, the offending phrase in the video that is getting this activist charged featured a talk by University of Sydney professor emeritus Bronwyn Winter. With the indisputably accurate observation, this is what she is being charged for posting a video of a professor saying this: "A person who identifies as transgender retains their DNA from birth. No surgery, synthetic hormones, or clothing changes that fact." That activist could spend up to 5 years in prison if convicted just for reposting the obviously scientifically true statement of a professor from Australia. So this is really wild stuff, and it could ramp up very, very quickly. The prosecutor, here's what the prosecutor said about the defendant. The defendant claimed that trans women are not women because they were obviously born male. This content highlights discrimination on the part of the accused since she used biological understanding as subterfuge to express her prejudice. By sharing this bias online, it reinforces a transphobic line of thought that suggests viewing the LGBTIQIA+ community and its members as pejorative or inferior. So the platform of respect will literally make it possible for the government to keep track of conversations happening anywhere online, posting basic statements of scientific reality expressed by professors in other countries. Then it takes all the statements that it gathers by AI, stores them, and again, forwards them to prosecutors so that people can be prosecuted. This is one of the scariest developments because as we went through in the Isabella Sipa interview, Brazil and other Latin American countries are kind of being used as a test case. NGOs, LGBT NGOs are pouring an enormous amount of cash into the country, and they're test running their AI platform of respect there. But if it works well, as in if it works effectively at hunting down political dissidents, as Isabella said, it's probably going to be exported elsewhere. And there are a lot of trans activists in the West who would love to get their hands on this kind of Orwellian technology. There is good news in Alberta on the euthanasia file because Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has just sent a mandate letter to Justice Minister Mickey Amery directing him to draft and introduce new legislation on euthanasia to ensure better oversight of so-called medical aid in dying, or MAID as they call it in Canada. And this is essentially Alberta's attempt to prohibit permitting people suffering solely from mental illness to access euthanasia. This is desperately needed. And as we've talked about in this podcast quite a bit, Danielle Smith's Alberta is kind of proving to the rest of Canada that you can just do things, that you can actually pass parental rights laws, that you can pass laws that limit transgender ideology and the harms of transgender ideology. Now they're basically doing the same thing for euthanasia. So in December of last year, Smith's United Conservative government already indicated that they wanted to address growing concerns with Canada's euthanasia regime, and mainstream media outlets predictably attacked the move. CBC actually reported that this is such a gross sentence. CBC said some are concerned new limitations could impact already vulnerable Albertans. Yeah, by denying them a lethal injection. You don't hate the CBC enough. It is a truly repulsive news organization that basically functions as the propaganda arm of dying with dignity and LGBT groups at this point. So Premier Smith has now followed through on that promise, and the September 25 mandate letter, which lays out directives on a wide range of issues, basically says, as led, work with relevant ministries to introduce legislation to provide greater oversight and appropriate safeguards for medical assistance in dying, and prohibit medical assistance in dying where a person seeks this procedure based solely on a mental illness. That's fantastic. We've already covered in the past the Right to Recover Act, which is currently working its way through the process in federal parliament, put forward by MP Tamara Jansen and seconded by MP Andrew Lawton. That is still a bill very worthy of all of our support, but now Alberta is also launching a provincial initiative to do the same thing. And so that's really fantastic. I want to linger just for a moment on the CBC's coverage because it's worth exposing their lies considering they're the taxpayer-funded state broadcaster. They falsely claimed that mental illness, quote, has never been an approved sole eligibility factor for MAID, though the government has considered permitting it. That is garbage. It's objectively untrue. The Trudeau government passed Bill C-7, which legalized MAID for those struggling with mental illness back in 2021. But the eligibility expansion, which is legal, has just been delayed twice, in 2023 and in 2024, but is currently slated to come into effect in 2027. That is not mentioned by the CBC. This is a lie by omission combined with an overt lie. And so their entire coverage of Alberta trying to protect Albertans struggling with mental illness was just gross. So in addition to their disinformation on euthanasia for mental illness, they reported that, quote, Smith's letter directing new provincial legislation on MAID comes almost a year after the government surveyed just under 20,000 Albertans on whether they think the province should step in. Nearly half of those surveyed disagreed with putting in more guardrails on MAID decision. So I went through all the numbers myself, and nearly half is an unbelievably deceitful way of reporting on those results. 62% were in favor of legislation for a dedicated agency monitoring euthanasia processes. 55% were in favor of a may dispute mechanism that allowed families or eligible others to challenge decisions to protect vulnerable people, such as those, this is key, with disabilities or mental health struggles. And 67% supported restricting euthanasia to those with physical illnesses rather than mental illnesses. And the CBC did not report on a single one of those numbers. So if you read something in the CBC, you're probably being lied to. And you need to just recognize that they orient all of their coverage to backing a couple of extremist groups on the Canadian left-wing fringe, and that's essentially their primary function. But anyways, this is still a good news story, and that Premier Danielle Smith does not listen to the CBC. The rest of you shouldn't either. And she's now moving forward to protect Albertans with mental health issues, and I think every other premier should consider doing the same thing. Premier Danielle Smith is really leading the way on a number of social conservative issues, and it's embarrassing, I think, for premiers that are socially conservative to see a libertarian who is not even socially conservative leading the way and having more guts than most of them on these issues. So there's a couple of other stories I think that really highlight why this is so necessary. So one of the worst stories that I've seen recently came from a recent report from the Office of the Ontario Chief Coroner's May Death Review Committee, which is quite the title. And one of the many awful stories that this report emphasized was how a frail woman with dementia was euthanized in Ontario. She was in her late 80s. And she was euthanized after a family member brought forward a request for assisted death. And she was given a lethal injection after a euthanasia provider deemed the woman had given her final expressed consent to proceed based on her ability to repeat a question and squeeze the provider's hand. That's it. A woman in her late 80s struggling with the early stages of dementia. And this case was one of 103 in the Death Review Committee's report where dementia was cited as a primary source of suffering that made the patient eligible for the lethal injection. And the committee, this is a government committee, warned that these cases introduce a lot of new factors that need to be navigated very carefully. And let me quote directly from the report here. Made requests involving dementia require additional considerations for interpreting eligibility criteria, assessing capacity, and ensuring informed consent. The reported suffering of persons with dementia was higher for experiences such as loss of dignity, being a perceived burden on family, friends, or caregivers, and emotional distress, anxiety, fear, and existential suffering, as well as a loss of independence compared to persons with other CODs or causes of death. It's significant in that context that the elderly woman who was euthanized had a family member request the lethal injection on her behalf, and the report noted that she needed assistance for basically all normal tasks, including eating, and states, at one point during her admission, Mrs. 6F, which is how the report refers to her, reportedly expressed a wish to die to a family member. This was communicated to her care team, who initiated a referral for MAID. Her expression of a wish to die was interpreted by a family member as a potential request for MAID. So there's a lot of gray territory here. And so despite that initial statement, which was not necessarily a request, but interpreted as one, the woman asked not to be euthanized and was instead moved into long-term care. And 4 months later, a family member initiated a re-referral for MAID. And the report noted that her suffering was exacerbated by her dependency and cognitive decline. And then here's how the National Post summarized it. The MAID provider assessed her eligibility over a single interaction and with a family member present. The provider stated it was clear she did not want to continue to live as she was, which is, again, not a request for euthanasia. And the woman could not even communicate clearly, and she could not consign the consent form. Even though they tried to get her the consent form, she proved unable to sign it, and it was unclear that she even knew what she was being asked to sign. And the report, the government report, noted that despite her repetition of a question from the provider and squeezing a hand, this is not an indication of understanding or appreciating a healthcare decision. especially considering her cognitive capabilities and the dependence on a family member that illustrated potential opportunity for undue influence. And the report emphasized that her consent was in question for multiple reasons. It's easy to kind of just look over this as another horror story and another report on Canada's euthanasia regime. But think about this for a minute. Not a pro-life activist, not an opponent of euthanasia, the Death Review Committee of Ontario's chief coroner basically says none of the proper steps were followed here. She couldn't sign the consent form. It wasn't clear she knew what the consent form even said. A family member was in the room, leading to potential coercion or pressure, and it was unclear that she understood what was going on. She repeated a question, but that does not count as consent, and yet they gave her a lethal injection and killed her anyways. So the government document emphasizes that nothing that was supposed to happen actually happened. And of course, it is my view that doctors should not be killing people anyways. But yet, we act like, okay, this statement really, or this incident really means we should be looking closer at the euthanasia regime. No, a doctor killed somebody who was not legally capable of giving consent to be killed, if such a thing should even be permitted. And yet it happened. And so this is one of the reasons it's so important for premiers like Danielle Smith, MPs like Andrew Lawton and Tamara Jansen to be doing whatever they can to try and expose Canadians to the truth of what's going on and legislate new barriers before we just get used to this kind of thing. This kind of story 10 years ago would have horrified people, right? A woman was given a lethal injection based on the second request by an unnamed family member after a previous wish to die had been interpreted as a request to receive a lethal injection by another family member. Then the woman asked not to be euthanized, couldn't consign the consent form, is dead. This story should horrify us, and we need to take action on these stories while people still have the capacity to be horrified, rather than just getting used to this sort of nonstop conveyor belt of euthanasia stories. Because in the Netherlands and Belgium, a lot of people have just gotten used to really horrifying stories, including one where an elderly woman with dementia was held down by family members while the doctor gave her a lethal injection. That one was so horrifying it ended up in court, but the judge ruled that the euthanasia practitioner had been essentially acting in good faith, and that it didn't count as murder. They had to hold her down after putting sedatives in her coffee. We can get used to this stuff, because the moment we get used to this stuff, it means that Canada's euthanasia regime is going to continue to expand. Next, it's going to be mental illness. Then it's going to be mature minors or children, which dying with dignity already wants and is asking for. And that's going to lead us to scenarios which are even more horrifying than this one, where you're going to have euthanasia practitioners having the legal right to go into the home of parents and essentially euthanize somebody struggling with crippling mental illness, and they will not be able to keep the person showing up to put their family member to death out of their home on pain of law. That is where we're heading. That is where Dying with Dignity wants to go. And so please do everything that you can. We have this. If you're in Alberta, send an encouraging email to Danielle Smith, because this is fantastic. If you're anywhere in Canada, please do email your MP about Tamara Jansen and Andrew Lawton's bill. If you have a story to share with your MP, please do so. Stories mean a lot. Again, we'll drop a link for the legislative efforts that are underway in the description of this video. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to all these stories. We hope that you were informed by these stories. Please do join the conversation by dropping a comment, like the video. If you found it helpful, share it around with your friends so more people can be exposed to this commentary.